Hi everyone, welcome to week 3. I'll try and slow my voice down a little bit more today, but no guarantee of it. So what we're looking at today is the further exploration of our forms of assessment. So we're particularly focusing today on our observations and our standardised tests. Now, we don't want to use a whole lot of standardised tests in early childhood, but they are a way that we have that is used in a lot of schools. So let's have a little think about our assessment recap from last week. Main things are we have to have a clear purpose of our assessment. We have to ensure that our assessment is designed to improve student learning and create a much deeper understanding for us as educators in some way. We are looking at the 3 main points of assessment for learning, assessment of learning, and assessment as learning. So remember, assessment for learning occurs when we use what we have found out about the kids to inform our teaching. Assessment as learning is when we get the kids involved a little bit more and the students are reflecting on and monitoring their progress in some way. And our assessment of learning is when we're using the evidence that the students produce for us to judge them against, particularly things like our judging standards, our achievement links, or going against some developmental milestones that we might be looking at if we're working with our very young children. So assessment is how we gather the information. And our main things are observations. We've got work samples where appropriate. We use interviews where appropriate, and we use tests where appropriate. And then you think about recording the information is through observational records, anecdotal notes, checklists, rubrics, and rating scales. So talk about is this idea of objectivity. Now, when we talk about objectivity, that means that we don't sit and add labels and stereotypes to the children. So we don't write down that they're obviously autistic, they just haven't been diagnosed yet. We can say they demonstrate many of the categories that might lead to an diagnosis of autism. We can say certain things on our writing, but we don't want to put a label and give that as an excuse for children. So labels merely help us to understand why the behaviour is happening and how we can possibly best support it. Labels are not an excuse for us to say we don't have to do that because they are whatever. Labels give us a way of dealing with those children. So we need to be very, very careful about how and when we label children. Stereotyping devalues the purpose of the assessment. So just because they're a boy doesn't mean they do certain things, or just because they're a girl doesn't mean they should do this, or just because they are an EALD student or an Indigenous student and so on doesn't mean that we expect certain things, good or bad. So that's what stereotyping does. We shouldn't jump to any conclusions. We need to make sure that the assessment is completely objective. So we don't want it coloured by what we think should happen. So just like when we do a science investigation, we take the data as what is presented to us. When we are looking at observations in a classroom and we are looking at assessment, we want to make sure that we are objective all the time. And we have to be objective in both of the elements of when we collect the information and when we record the information. So when we're collecting the information and we're writing down some notes, we don't want it coloured by, but they usually do it much better. At that point in time, this is what they're able to do. And that's what we need to be really clear about, is to make sure that we are including all of the relevant data and recording all of the relevant data. If we're pretty sure that that's not what they normally do another set of observations a day or 2 later. They might be sick, they might be having a really bad day, and so on. But we need to make sure that we are the objective party in there. We don't want to have those negative connotations and false impressions that colour our recording of the information. Because if we want to be able to take this to another interested party, such as the school psychologist, even our admin team, to be able to go and say, gosh, I am really concerned about this child, one of the first things someone from admin, or even if you say you want to get the school psychologist involved, is they'll say, have you collected lots of data? And you'll be able to go hand on heart and say, absolutely, I've collected it over a period of the last month. I've made sure that I've done some in the morning, some in the afternoon, some on the days when they're getting dropped off by mum, some on the days they're getting dropped off by daycare, and so on. So you want to be really clear about what, when, and why you're collecting that information, and avoid all of the categories and labels, because that's what leads us to make incorrect judgments and sometimes to miss certain things, because we might go, oh, they have whatever label, therefore that's what they're doing, whereas sometimes it's not. So I know I've worked with lots of children with autism in different classes, and sometimes there is the behaviors that are coming out through the autism, and sometimes the behaviors are coming out because they're just being really, really stubborn, and we need to isolate out what are the different behaviors so that we can best create the environment for them to have maximum learning. So we have to make sure that we are the objective party in there. And then matching in with our objectivity is ensuring we are confidential. Now, I know lots of people go, well, of course I'm not going to talk about it. But we really do need to be aware of this, that when we are recording data about children, we need to make sure that we decide what and how it's going to be shared with others. Now, this can work both ways. We can overshare, but we can also undershare, because we know that sometimes things don't get recorded in the right places, and children have 2 or 3 years of going through issues, but it's not being recorded in the right way, so we don't have a compilation of data when finally they get to year 2, and all the little things that have been going on through kindy, pre-primary, year 1, and then finally in year 2, we find out that it's not just a developmental issue. They actually have a proper diagnosis that we can now go through and say, well, actually they've been diagnosed with dyslexia, and they have a hearing issue, and they have some sight issues. And each of those things could have been picked up much earlier, but we didn't have a good process in the school. So think about your confidentiality. You don't want to keep everything to yourself, but you also don't want to go blurting it out in the staff room. Now, parents have to give consent before records are passed on to other persons or institutions. So you can't do a whole lot of observations, have the school psychologist come in, them do observations, have a chat and all of that without involving the parents. So they have a right to privacy as well. Sometimes it is the most frustrating thing in the world when you are asking to have further investigation of particular things that you're a bit worried about, and the parents say no. But you don't have the right to usurp their views. You're the person in that position of trust. You have to make sure that you are following through in the best way possible. So ethically, we need to make sure we don't comment negatively about the child in front of others. Now, we know in staff room that oftentimes we do talk about children. There's nothing wrong with that. What's wrong is when you go in with that very negative stance and you are doing that in an open situation. You can say to another trusted teacher, can I really have a chat with you privately about so-and-so in my class? I believe you have had them previously. I would love to have a chat with you about some of the observations that I have written about over the last couple of weeks with their behaviour. And so that is a respectful way of respecting the child and respecting the caregivers as well. So you're the person who needs to maintain that trust. Now you need to make sure that you keep your records somewhere safe. I had a parent who loved to fossick through my desk, and I don't know why, she just felt she had that need. So I would have to make sure that my assessment records were always kept in the storeroom for that year that I had that particular parent in my classroom. And because she would, I don't know how or why she thought she could, but she would flick through my assessment file because I used to keep everything in paper at that time. Whereas now everything might be on paper, but you might also have things that are in various digital forms. So be really aware of where they are stored. And as I said, sometimes you need them to be stored in a public place that the right people can access it. But when I say public, I don't mean public for parents to access it. So anything that is received from a professional, such as a full psychological testing or something that, they might have gone through a particular professional for something, those need to be kept centralized within the school, so in the office and so on. You may have a copy that is in your room, but you need to make sure they are given to the right people in the office in some way. And I'm overt with my EAs and with any parents who are volunteers. Some schools run little sessions at the beginning of the year explaining about confidentiality and what they may observe in a classroom if they're coming to help out in the classroom. So just be really aware of things like this. I've had quite a few incidences in my teaching career where different teachers have been put in awkward positions that they could have avoided. So be really careful about your confidentiality. Now, in terms of assessment, let's think about how frequent we need to do it. Now, when you are observing and when you are taking note of children, you need to decide how often and what type. So the frequency is not determined by, I must do this every week, but sometimes it's determined by what you have previously observed. So then you know that you need to observe a lot more on that particular child. I generally say while you're on prac to try every 2 weeks to do a cycle of observations about each child. And that's not including the ones directly related to your classroom teaching. But to think about how you do your observations and your assessments. If you're working in a childcare centre, we know that that is much more regular about different things. So think about how often and what type. Deep observations and assessments, they require time on your part, and they also require time from the investment of working with the children and so on. So some of your assessments will be decided by the school. A lot of schools have assessment schedules for their standardized testing. So the PAT test happens in term 2, and then term 3 is different types of tests. NAPLAN is terms 2, well, it's moving to term 1 now, but it'll be end of term 1 for years 3 and 5 in your class. You've got your on-entry testing that we're talking about. That happens at the beginning of the year. You might have schools that do the MAI or the OB survey. So those are determined by the school, and then you determine other assessments by your needs within the classroom. But please be sensible. Do not try and over-assess, because you will go nuts. And what I suggest to teachers as well is, if you know that you have the year 3s and the year 5s for the older kids, obviously, but get your kids to practice doing some different little tests. If you know you've got standardized tests, don't just launch it onto them. Give them some practice ones, so then it becomes normalized. Don't build it up and make it bigger than Ben-Hur. Just keep it as this is what we do in our class. This is how we go about this process. So with our observation, I find this is the thing that I am doing the most in early years. So it is our key method for our assessment. It is the way that we see what is going on in our room, because quite often the children are at a point where they're not reading and writing. So therefore the things that we are seeing and hearing, they are the things that we need to take note of. They form our assessment. Oftentimes people think assessment has to be a written piece. It doesn't. It can be a full range of different items that you collect, and they can be all different types of work samples. They can be, like I said, the simple interviews, they can be discussions, they can be lots and lots of things. So there are lots of factors that you need to take into account. When we are thinking about our observations, we need to be aware it's not just looking. We want you to have an intentional point of doing that observation, because otherwise you're literally just staring at the kids and you don't know what you're looking at. So, are you looking for their social interactions? Are you looking for their gross motor development? Are you looking at their pencil grip? Are you looking at their way that they hold something because you're a little bit worried about their strength in some way? Are you looking at their running ability because they keep falling over all the time and you're a bit concerned about their eyesight? Are you observing their speech? So you're listening when they're talking with you at one of the play centres that you're working with their dramatic play. So what is your point for it? Have an intentional reason why you are doing those observations. So what we're doing is, people often talk about, I'm going to do anecdotal notes. I'm like, what is the point of an anecdotal note? Have a reason for that observation. So rather than just writing down the anecdotal notes, write it down for reason. So think, gosh, I am a little bit worried about this little girl. When she arrives in the morning, her hair is never done. So I'm going to take note of which days of the week that her hair comes in looking a bit tatty and ratty. So then we'll be able to go, okay, so when she is at grandma's, she comes in with her hair done really neatly. However, when she's at daycare, in the morning, she goes to before school care, her hair's not. So who's dropping her off? What's happening? And then you can start to take some notes. So today's lecture is all on this idea of our formal intentional observations, making sure that you're not just doing random notes at some point. So with our observations, when we're observing, we should make sure that they're not distracting from the instructions. So we don't want to pull the children away from their play. Just sit off to the side. You can see a lot when you're not directly staring at the children. So sometimes I will listen for speech issues and I will just be sitting and it looks like I'm just writing some things down next to the writing centre. But I'm listening to the way they are interacting with one another, and I'm listening for the particular speech patterns that I'm a little bit worried about. So then I can observe in a more natural environment, because sometimes when a child is put under stress by talking to an adult, they will speak differently to when they're speaking to a peer. So I want my observations to include both of those. So it shouldn't distract from what's going on. It should always lead to an improvement with our observations. So I want to look at, what are they doing well? Because I'll be like, wow, did they really do that? Okay, let's go and have a look. So sometimes you will see the child in kindy who can read. And you're like, hang on a minute, did they just do that? So then you can go over and you can take note of different things. Observation should never cause anxiety for the children. So don't say, now I'm just going to watch how you do this and, make a big song and dance about it. Just respect their privacy and dignity and just say, oh, I'm just listening for how wonderfully you're speaking with one another. That is fantastic. And you don't even have to let them know that you're recording anything down. So you want to respect the privacy and dignity. Some children can read very early, so you don't want them coming and looking over your shoulder and seeing that you're writing a whole lot of notes about James. So please respect the child. Sometimes I would write notes, but I would not put the child's name on there at all, because I knew that I had a couple of kids who could read very well and that they would be able to see straight away what I was writing. So really think about how you're going to make sure that you respect the privacy and dignity of every child in your class. So our guidelines: have a clear purpose for what you are doing with your observations. Where possible, you want to make sure the children don't know you're observing them, because that way you're not able to get the fancy way that they do it. You don't want to interrupt that sequence of behaviour. And if you want to observe things like their interactions with others, you got to observe from a distance. And you'll be picking up all of the non-verbals, you'll be watching what they're doing, you'll be listening, but you're not actually involved in it. So they're your clear guidelines for that one. But always know why you are doing it. That's my clear thing. Always have a purpose, not just a random set. And think, as a teacher, if you interrupt, you're going to change and alter the observation that you're about to see. So that's why you observe from a distance. So, steps involved when we are doing some focused observations. First of all, decide what is your purpose. So, I'm going to be looking at social interactions when these 3 children are in the dramatic play centre, because I'm a little bit worried about the violence that comes out of one child every so often. I select my location. So, I select my vantage point. So, I'm going to pop a chair a couple of metres away. I'm going to observe them for the first 15 minutes of that play, because that appears to be when things go pear-shaped and I see things being thrown around. I'm going to decide whether and what type of observation I'm going to do. So I might be doing a running record every couple of minutes, writing down what I see. So I decide how long I'm going to sit there and what I'm going to observe. Remember, I want to have a focus for my observation. Now, I might focus just on the interactions at the play kitchen, not all the other interactions, because it seems to be that one child has difficulty sharing. So I work out my record sheet that I'm going to have, and then I go through and I complete my observations. Now, if I am really considerate about everything, first of all, I should ask for permission from the parents if I am doing observations or I am involving anyone else. If I am just doing my standard teacher observations, then I do not need to get parent permission. If I am doing observations that are with someone else or are possibly controversial or getting kids to do something that's, then ask permission. But if I'm doing my standard teacher things in a classroom, I don't need to ask permission from parents to sit and observe their child. But I do not want to observe the child in an unfamiliar setting. So I don't want to take the child from pre-primary up to the year 1 and say to the year 1 teacher, let's have a look at how they interact in the year 1 room. No, that's just going to be stressful for everyone. Now, the next thing that you need to think about is your code of conduct. So you need to make sure that you are not in a room alone with a child. So I see this happen quite often and I'm like, oh. So sometimes teachers will take a child into, say, the storeroom to go and do a recorded individual reading activity, and they'll close the door because they actually want to record it. That's not a good thing to do. Swap it round the other way. Put them off somewhere else in the school where it has a glass door. You'll find in schools now most doors have a big glass panel in them. There's very few doors that do not have something that sees through in some way. So you don't want to be left in a room alone with a child. It just protects you and protects the child. As I've said before, protect the confidentiality. So that means don't say, I'm just off to observe James because I'm a bit worried about this and this, and have that in earshot of other children or other teachers. And whenever we're doing observations, if they're one-on-one or they are in a group, we make sure that we write them objectively. We remove all of the emotive statements that are in there. Now we've done our observations, so what do we do with them? Most important, don't file them away. Assessment is to inform us. And when we say us, it means the school, not just, and it could mean the caregivers as well, or it could mean external people. It's not just for you. So think, what do you do with them? Make a plan of action. So if your observations confirm what you're a bit worried about, make an action plan to say, okay, next steps are we get the parents in, this is what we do, this next thing, and so on. Have a chat with your trusted advisors at the school. It could be another teacher, it could be a member of the admin team, but make your plan of action of what you're going to do. Consult with whoever you need to. So if you are planning to involve any external agencies, you will have to speak to your admin team. You will have to speak to your line manager in some way. And always keep in mind with your observations that assessment always needs to inform your future planning. So keep it as that cycle. So if you're doing it to talk to caregivers, it should be because you want to create the best experience for the children in your classroom. And if you are needing to write down your observations and keep records constantly, it should inform your future planning. So let's have a think about some issues that could happen. So my observations indicate a problem with typical development. Do more observations, because what we want to know is definitively, are things working or not? So if your records indicate that a child hasn't grasped a skill or concept, how is that going to change with your planning? So how are you going to make sure that you are giving the best opportunities for that child to improve and be able to demonstrate that skill or concept to you? And finally, woohoo, your observations show everything is as expected. So that's great. Just do regular observations to make sure everything is on track. So when we think about observations, we have to realize that there are some pros and cons to it. So if we look at strengths of observations, the children don't need to read and write to be assessed. We can do it quite unobtrusively. So we don't have to be in their face. We don't have to be sitting next to them. We don't have to collect their work. We can just be observing them. So the kids don't need to be aware that they're being assessed. We don't need to change what we do. We just need to ensure that we have set up the right locations, places, situations, and so on. And of course, the kids are in their normal setting. We're not taking them out, because I know when I've had to have my children assessed and they go along to the pediatricians and so on, oh my goodness, it's a drama. It's a drama getting them out of the house because they're stressed. They don't want to do it. They're not sure what's going to happen. They don't tend to give the best selves over. So observations are our most direct and valid way, and we need to be able to observe the behaviours in authentic context. Now, what are some weaknesses? Well, obviously, we can't assess everything through observation. We need to get them to articulate things. So sometimes we will need to intervene to do that. Now, observations do require quite a bit of attention and time from the teacher. It's not something you can sit and do an observation in 20 seconds. So you need to have time to do it, and you'll need to organise your other adults in the room so that you can observe correctly. And you can unfortunately have what we often term the halo effect that colours the observer's perceptions. And so if you like a child, you might not see the real issues. And conversely, if that child is one you find a bit tricky to deal with, you might pick up everything. But that's not always a bad thing, because sometimes it's good to know lots and lots of data about a child. So for example, our notes and our comments, we've got this observation about Lauren and Catherine, and Matt is trying to join in, and we look at the different kids, we look at what's gone on. The observation is quite matter of fact, the notes and comments, all right, and are a way of commenting about it. Now for me, when I look at that, I'm like, good on Matt. He's observed, he's noted that he can talk to the children, to the two girls, and he has worked out a way to join into the play without upsetting the girls. So that's a really simple comment. Matt's learned how to enter the group. Fantastic. Out of context, you might go, yep, simple observation, but it could be that you've been doing a lot of work with Matt on how to be able to ask to join in without intervening and having to facilitate that as the adult sometimes. So we've got this idea of observations being our main thing that we use as our assessment tool, particularly in our very early years. Then we have other things that are used around the world, and we've got screening tools. Now, there are a range of screening tools that are used, and there's tools that are used in Australia, and then there's lots of tools that are used over in the US, which are fantastic because you can actually have a look at them because they can help you to identify any developmental issues. So screening tools are not your straight observations of a child. Screening tools identify very broad issues. They're more designed to give you a picture of the development of the child as opposed to the teaching and learning aspects of it. So your teaching and learning, that's not assessed in a screening tool. Screening tools assesses a developmental process. Great with screening tools to be able to chat with parents and to kind of help you focus any of your concerns. It's also really good to see things like patterns in the cohorts. So I'd say most common screening tool that we have is our on-entry assessment that's generally taken in pre-primary. Basically, it's a diagnostic tool and it looks at our literacy and numeracy and uses hands-on materials and is conducted in an online format. So you can go to the Education Department website, and it's conducted between weeks 3 to 6 of term 1, and teachers individually assess each pre-primary student with oral language, reading, writing, and numeracy. And this is taken directly from the site as well. So this is for parents to be able to see that generally most schools will send a note home, but parents can have a look on this website as well. Some schools send out summaries, some schools don't send out summaries. I find it really interesting to have a look at the data that comes out of the on-entry assessments, because it often confirms your observations that you still have at around term 2 or term 3. Go back and have a look at the on-entry data, particularly when you go out on prac, because you'll be able to see the children that you are a little bit concerned about. You'll be able to go back to their on-entry data and go, oh yeah, they were showing that they were lower than expected, or that they were higher than expected, or they were pretty much on average. If a child is pretty much on average at the on-entry assessment, but then by the end of year 1, they're performing well below average, that would be a reason for us to be able to look at and intervene, and would need a lot more observations to be able to see what's going on. So if we think about our assessment, we go back to our idea that our tutorial next week, we've got some really cool videos to look at. We're going to take some observations, and we're going to use a variety of running records, and we're going to try and be very objective and so on. And we're going to look at how they fit with our domains and what we would then be able to look at to report to parents and so on. And we're going to have a chat about standardized testing in early childhood. So thank you very much, and I will see you all in our tutorials.